The evening began as uneventfully as any other. Edward leaned against the headboard, holding Nora's favorite storybook. Her head rested on his shoulder as he animatedly read aloud. And then the brave knight said. He paused for effect, looking at her wide-eyed. Nora giggled, clapping her hands. He saved the princess, right, Daddy? Of course, Pumpkin. The knight always saves the day. Edward kissed her forehead, feeling a pang of warmth he hadn't felt in weeks. Jessica's absence weighed heavier than he cared to admit. Mommy would have loved this story, wouldn't she? Nora asked, her tiny voice tinged with curiosity. Edward hesitated, choosing his words carefully. She would, sweetheart. But she's having a fun time with her friends this weekend. We'll tell her all about it when she's back. Nora nodded but then perked up suddenly, her little brow furrowed. Daddy, why does Mommy go to the lake house without us? Can we go there someday? She always says it's her favorite place. Edward forced a smile. Maybe next summer, he said, though the words felt hollow. Jessica had been going to the lake house more frequently. Her reasons were plausible enough. A girl's retreat, a break to recharge. But her tone had been off, distant, rehearsed. Her once effortless affection had turned into obligatory pecks on the cheek, and her laughter no longer filled their home. He shook off the nagging doubts, unwilling to entertain suspicions about the woman he had loved for over a decade. Later that evening, Edward cleaned up the dinner plates, humming softly to himself. The house was quiet. Nora had fallen asleep, her stuffed bunny tucked under her arm. Edward settled on the couch, scrolling through his phone aimlessly, when it buzzed unexpectedly. Daddy. Nora's voice was shaky, her whisper laced with fear. Edward's heart jumped. He sat up straighter, gripping the phone. Nora? What's wrong? Did you have a bad dream? No, I'm not in bed, she replied. I'm at Mommy's room, at the lake house. Edward's stomach dropped. Nora, why are you there? Where's Mommy? Her breathing hitched. Mommy and Uncle Derek are here. They don't know I'm awake. They're being weird? Edward froze. Weird? What do you mean? They were hugging and kissing, Daddy. Not like how you hug me. And she hesitated, her voice breaking. They said bad things about you. They said you're boring. I don't like it. His pulse thundered in his ears. Nora, listen to me carefully. Where are you now? I'm hiding in the closet. I brought my iPad. Good girl, Edward said, his voice steady despite the storm building inside him. Stay there, okay? Don't come out. I'm going to fix this. But Daddy, she whimpered, I recorded it. They were saying such mean things and doing stuff I don't even know how to say. Edward's breath hitched. You recorded it? Yes, Nora sniffled. I'll send it to you. But I don't want to stay with her anymore, Daddy. She lied to me. I hate lies. I know, sweetheart. I know, he said softly. Send me the video and then close your eyes. I'll take care of everything. The call ended, leaving Edward staring blankly at the darkened screen. Moments later, his phone buzzed again. His heart thudded in his chest as he opened the file Nora had sent. The video began with muffled sounds. Edward adjusted the volume, and Jessica's voice became clear. Derek, stop. You'll wake her up. She's a heavy sleeper, Derek replied with a laugh, pulling Jessica closer. Besides, we deserve some fun after all the sneaking around. Edward clenched his fists, his breathing shallow. The camera angle shifted, and there they were, Jessica and Derek on the couch, their intimacy undeniable. Jessica giggled, her head resting against Derek's shoulder. He's such a boring pushover, always talking about family dinners and savings plans. He'll never suspect anything. Derek smirked. You're too good for him, Jess. You deserve excitement, passion, not whatever dull life he's offering. Edward couldn't watch anymore. He paused the video, his hand shaking. The betrayal felt like a punch to the gut, but the venom in their words, the ridicule of his efforts to build a stable life, cut even deeper. He stared into the void, the weight of their words pressing down on him. His thoughts swirled chaotically. Was he truly so blind? Had he ignored all the signs? Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. Finally, Edward stood, his resolve hardening. He wouldn't let Jessica's betrayal destroy him. More importantly, he wouldn't let Nora be caught in the crossfire of their deceit. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. Hey, Benjamin, he said when his best friend answered groggily. Sorry to call so late, but I need a favor. It's serious. Benjamin was instantly alert. What's going on? Are you okay? I'll explain everything later. I need to get Nora and me out of here. Can you help? Of course. Whatever you need. Edward spent the night planning meticulously. By dawn, he had contacted his lawyer, secured temporary housing, and begun arranging for the children's belongings to be discreetly moved out. He left nothing to chance. Before Jessica returned from her girls' weekend, Edward left a manila envelope on the kitchen counter. It contained the divorce papers, a copy of the incriminating video, and a note, "Jessica, the kids and I are gone. They've chosen me. Don't bother looking for us. Derek's wife will be in touch soon. Good luck handling that." Edward. Jessica pulled into the driveway, humming along to the pop song on the radio. Her weekend at the lake house with Derek had gone exactly as planned. She felt confident, almost invincible. Edward never suspected a thing, and the thought made her smile. Grabbing her overnight bag, she stepped out of the car and walked to the front door, keys jangling in her hand. She paused briefly to straighten her hair and adjust her coat, rehearsing her usual script. "It was amazing, babe. Just what I needed to recharge," she murmured under her breath, practicing her alibi one last time. Pushing open the door, she called out, "Hey, honey, I'm home." Her voice echoed through the house. No reply. She frowned, stepping inside and setting her bag down. "Edward? Nora?" The house was eerily quiet. No sounds of Nora's giggles, no TV in the background, no clatter of dishes in the kitchen. Jessica's pulse quickened. She walked further into the living room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. On the kitchen counter, something caught her eye. A manila envelope sat next to a flash drive. The envelope had her name scrawled on the front in Edward's unmistakable handwriting. Her stomach churned. "What's this?" she muttered, stepping closer. She picked up the envelope, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened it. The first thing she saw were divorce papers, neatly filled out, with Edward's signature already in place. Her eyes widened, panic setting in. "No, no," she whispered, flipping through the pages. "This can't be happening." Her hands moved to the flash drive. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity and fear got the better of her. Grabbing her laptop from the dining table, she inserted the drive and opened the file. The video started. At first, the screen was dark, the sound of muffled voices filling the room. Then the camera adjusted, revealing her and Derek on the couch at the lake house. Jessica's face turned pale as she watched herself laughing, her head on Derek's shoulder, her hand trailing along his arm. "No," she whispered, shaking her head as if denying it would make the footage disappear. The voices grew clearer. "He's such a boring pushover," Jessica's recorded voice sneered. "He'll never suspect a thing." Derek's laugh followed. "You're too good for him, Jess. You deserve excitement, passion, not whatever dull life he's offering." Jessica slammed the laptop shut, her chest heaving. She could barely breathe, her world spinning out of control. Suddenly, Edward's voice rang out from the laptop speakers, startling her. "Jessica." His voice was calm, but the steel behind it was unmistakable. "The kids and I are gone. They've chosen me. Don't look for us. And just a heads up, Derek's wife has seen the video. She'll be in touch. Good luck with that." Her hands flew to her mouth as she let out a choked gasp. Tears blurred her vision as the weight of Edward's words sank in. "No," she whispered again, this time louder. "This isn't happening. This isn't real." Jessica stumbled to the couch, collapsing into it. Her mind raced. Where were Edward and the kids? How could he have known? And why would Nora? Her breath hitched. Nora. The pieces clicked into place. Jessica remembered waking up at the lake house and finding Nora still asleep in the guest room. At least, she had assumed Nora was asleep. The child must have overheard. No, worse, she must have seen. "Oh my God," Jessica said, her voice breaking. "What have I done?" She grabbed her phone, her fingers fumbling as she dialed Edward's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Edward, please," she pleaded, her voice trembling. "Please call me back. We could talk about this. You don't have to do this. I made a mistake. Just please, let's fix this for the kids." She hung up, but the silence that followed was deafening. Panic setting in, she tried calling again. And again. Each attempt ended the same way. Edward wasn't answering, and she was left alone with her thoughts. Jessica paced the living room, her hands clutching her head. Think, Jessica, think, she muttered to herself. She couldn't lose everything. Not like this. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of her phone buzzing. Hope surged in her chest as she snatched it up, expecting to see Edward's name. It wasn't Edward. The screen read Kimberly. Jessica's blood ran cold. Derek's wife. Her hand trembled as she answered the call. Hello. You destroyed my family. You home-wrecking snake. Kimberly spat, her voice sharp and full of venom. Kimberly, please. Jessica started, but Kimberly cut her off. Don't even try to deny it. I've seen the video. I've already filed for divorce, and Derek's getting nothing. But don't think you're off the hook. Everyone at work is going to know what kind of person you are. Jessica's knees buckled. Kimberly, I'm sorry, she stammered. I didn't mean for this to happen. Save your apologies, Kimberly snapped. You'll need them when your life falls apart. You deserve everything that's coming to you. The line went dead. Jessica stared at her phone, her hands shaking. The realization hit her like a freight train. She wasn't just losing her husband and children. Her affair with Derek would ripple through every aspect of her life, leaving nothing untouched. She sank back onto the couch, tears streaming down her face. The smug confidence she'd felt just hours earlier was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. Her phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a message from Edward. I'm taking care of Nora and Jack. Don't contact us. This is the life you chose, Jessica. Now live with it. Jessica dropped the phone, her sobs filling the empty house. The walls that had once held happy memories now felt suffocating, their silence a cruel reminder of her mistakes. For the first time in years, Jessica felt utterly alone. Jessica woke to the sharp sound of someone pounding on her front door. Her head throbbed, the aftermath of a sleepless night spent crying and replaying Edward's message in her mind. She stumbled to the door, her pulse quickening as the knocking grew louder and more insistent. When she opened it, she came face to face with Kimberly. Kimberly's expression was one of barely contained rage, her hands clenched at her sides. You have some nerve, Kimberly said coldly, stepping closer to Jessica. You thought you could destroy my family and just walk away? Jessica's stomach churned. Kimberly, I don't. Kimberly snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Don't you dare try to explain or justify what you did. You lied. You schemed. And for what? To have a fling with my husband while ruining everything we built. Jessica stepped back, feeling the weight of Kimberly's accusations like a physical blow. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she said weakly, her voice trembling. Kimberly's eyes narrowed. Didn't mean for it to go this far? You've been sneaking around with Derek for months. Do you think that's an accident? Do you think Edward and I deserve to clean up the wreckage of your selfishness? Jessica looked away, unable to meet Kimberly's piercing gaze. I made a mistake, she whispered. Kimberly laughed bitterly. A mistake? No, Jessica. A mistake is spilling coffee on someone. What you did was calculated. You knew what you were doing every time you texted him, every time you went to that lake house. Jessica opened her mouth to respond, but Kimberly wasn't finished. I saw the video. The smug way you both talked about your spouses, like we were obstacles in your little fantasy. Well, congratulations, Jessica. You've destroyed my family. And now you get to live with the fallout. Tears streamed down Jessica's face. Kimberly, please. Don't beg, Kimberly interrupted, her voice low and venomous. You don't deserve sympathy. You're going to find out what it's like to lose everything. I'll make sure of it. Without another word, Kimberly turned on her heel and stormed off, leaving Jessica standing in the doorway, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, Edward sat at a small kitchen table in a modest apartment, sipping his morning coffee. The move to a new city had been swift but necessary. Nora and Jack sat nearby, munching on their breakfast. Nora looked up at Edward, her face brighter than it had been in weeks. Daddy, are we going to the park today? Edward smiled. Of course, Pumpkin. After I finish unpacking a few more boxes, we'll go. Jack chimed in, his mouth full of cereal. Can we get ice cream, too? Edward laughed, ruffling his son's hair. We'll see. Maybe if you help me with those boxes. Their laughter filled the room, a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated their home before the move. Edward felt a flicker of hope. He had lost a marriage, but he still had his children, and he was determined to give them the stability and happiness they deserved. Over the next few weeks, Edward threw himself into building a new life. He poured hours into creating a business plan for a startup he had dreamed of for years, but never had the courage to pursue. With his savings and a small loan, he opened a digital marketing agency, working tirelessly to ensure its success. At night, after the kids were in bed, Edward would sit at his desk, researching, emailing potential clients, and fine-tuning his strategies. The work was grueling, but it gave him purpose, a way to channel his pain into something productive. Jessica's days, on the other hand, were a blur of shame and regret. Her attempt to contact Edward had been met with silence. The realization that her children wanted nothing to do with her was a pain she couldn't escape. To make matters worse, the fallout from her affair was spreading. Kimberly wasn't bluffing. News of the affair had reached their circle of friends and Derek's workplace. Jessica found herself ostracized, her once busy social calendar now empty. Her phone rang one evening, and she hesitated before answering, recognizing Derek's number. Jessica, Derek said, his tone strained. We need to talk. What is there to talk about? She replied bitterly. Your wife is tearing my life apart. You think my life's any better? Derek snapped. Kimberly S. filed for divorce. She's taken the kids, the house, everything. And my boss found out about us. I've been suspended. Jessica closed her eyes, the weight of their decisions crashing down on her. I didn't think it would end like this, she said softly. Neither did I, Derek replied. But here we are. A heavy silence hung between them before Derek spoke again. Look, I'm leaving town. There's nothing left for me here. You should think about doing the same. Jessica ended the call without responding. The thought of leaving crossed her mind. But where would she go? Edward and the kids were gone, and the life she had built was crumbling around her. Months passed. Edward's business flourished, his hard work paying off in the form of steady clients and growing revenue. He felt a sense of pride and accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. One evening, after a particularly successful meeting, Edward took the kids to their favorite pizza place to celebrate. As they ate, Nora looked up at him with a smile. Daddy, are we going to be okay now? She asked. Edward leaned over and kissed her forehead. We already are, Pumpkin. As he watched his children laugh and share a slice of pizza, Edward realized that he had found something Jessica and Derek never could piece. Meanwhile, Jessica sat alone in her empty house, the silence suffocating. She had reached out to Edward multiple times, each attempt ignored or blocked. She had tried to rebuild her life, but every effort seemed to fall apart. The doorbell rang, breaking the quiet. Jessica opened the door to find a deliverman holding an envelope. She signed for it and tore it open, her hands trembling. Inside was a letter from Edward's lawyer, officially finalizing the divorce. As Jessica read the document, tears blurred her vision. She had lost her family, her friends, and the respect of everyone she knew. The web she had spun had unraveled, leaving her with nothing but regret. In contrast, Edward closed the door to his home that evening, his children's laughter echoing in the background. He smiled to himself, ready to embrace the next chapter of his life, a life built on honesty, hard work, and the unbreakable bond with his children. Jessica stared at her phone, scrolling through her contacts, her thumb hovering over Edward's name. Weeks of silence had stretched into months, and the isolation was suffocating. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and every glance at an empty chair or untouched toy in the house twisted the knife of regret deeper. Her hands trembled as she finally pressed call. The phone rang once, twice. Then Edward answered, his tone sharp and controlled. What do you want, Jessica? Her throat tightened. Edward, I just wanted to talk. Talk about what? His words carried no warmth, no invitation to reconcile. Tears welled up in her eyes. Please, Edward, I've lost everything. I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. I miss you. I miss the kids. A bitter chuckle came from the other end. You miss us now? Where was this regret when you were at the lake house? Or when you were laughing at me with Derek? Jessica choked back a sob. I wasn't thinking. You were thinking, Jessica. Every step of the way. You planned it. You lied. And you didn't care about the consequences until they slapped you in the face, Edward said, his voice growing colder with every word. Jessica grasped for anything that might soften him. I'm sorry, Edward. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I want to fix this. I want my family back. There was a long pause, the silence on the line deafening. Then Edward spoke, his tone resolute. You didn't just betray me, Jessica. You betrayed our family, our children. You didn't just hurt me. You tore apart the only stable foundation they had. This is the life you chose. Now live with it. The line went dead. Jessica sat frozen, staring at the phone as the weight of his words settled over her. She wanted to scream, cry, do anything to numb the pain. But there was no escape from the crushing reality. Across town, Derek wasn't faring any better. Kimberly had made good on her promise. The divorce was finalized in record time, and Derek found himself living in a dingy studio apartment, stripped of everything he had taken for granted, his home, his children, and his reputation. At work, whispers followed him wherever he went. His once loyal colleagues avoided eye contact, their conversations halting the moment he entered the room. Management's decision to suspend him had turned into a full-blown termination, citing ethical concerns as the reason. Derek sat in his cramped apartment one evening, staring at a bottle of cheap whiskey. His phone buzzed, and he saw Jessica's name light up the screen. What do you want, Jess? He asked, his voice slurred. She hesitated, unsure what she was even seeking from him. How are you holding up? How do you think? He snapped. I've lost everything. Kimberly has got the kids, my job's gone, and my friends, well, let's just say they're not returning my calls. Jessica swallowed hard. Same here. I called Edward. I begged him to talk, but he doesn't want anything to do with me. Derek let out a bitter laugh. Can you blame him? We're the villains in this story, Jess. Nobody's coming to save us. The silence on the line was heavy, neither of them knowing what to say. Do you regret it? Jessica finally asked. Derek sighed. I don't know. I regret losing everything, sure. But at the time, I thought it was worth it. Guess I was wrong. Jessica felt a pang of bitterness. We both were. Edward, on the other hand, was thriving. His business had grown exponentially, and he had expanded his client base far beyond what he had initially imagined. His days were busy, but he made sure his evenings were reserved for his children. One night, as he helped Nora with her math homework, she looked up at him with a smile. Daddy, do you think Mommy misses us? She asked innocently. Edward paused, considering his response. I think she does, sweetheart. But sometimes, when people make bad choices, they have to face the consequences. Nora nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad we're with you. Edward smiled, ruffling her hair. Me too, pumpkin. Jessica's downward spiral continued. The once luxurious house felt like a prison, every room a reminder of what she had lost. She tried reaching out to her former friends, but the responses were either curt or non-existent. One evening, desperate for human interaction, she attended a social event at the urging of an old acquaintance. But the moment she walked into the room, the murmurs began. That's her, someone whispered. The one who cheated on her husband? With a married man? Another voice added. Jessica felt the stares, the judgment pressing down on her like a weight. She grabbed a drink and retreated to a corner, hoping to disappear into the background. But the whispers followed her. You'd think she'd have the decency to stay home, one woman said, loud enough for Jessica to hear. Her chest tightened, and she left the event early, her humiliation complete. Weeks later, Jessica and Derek ran into each other by chance at a coffee shop. Both looked worse for wear. Jessica's once polished appearance was now haggard, and Derek's disheveled state spoke volumes about his decline. Fancy meeting you here, Derek said, forcing a smile as he stirred his coffee. Jessica sighed. Small world, I guess. They sat in awkward silence before Derek broke it. So, Any chance things are getting better for you? Jessica shook her head. No, Edward won't talk to me. My kids don't want to see me, and I'm practically a pariah. You? Derek chuckled darkly. Pretty much the same. Lost my job, lost my family. Kimberly S. made sure I'll never recover my reputation. Jessica looked at him, a mix of pity and bitterness in her gaze. We really screwed up, didn't we? Derek nodded. Big time. They sat there for a while, two broken people reflecting on the choices that had brought them to this point. Edward, meanwhile, was beginning to open himself to the idea of moving on. At a charity event hosted by one of his clients, he struck up a conversation with a woman named Marley. She was kind, intelligent, and had a warmth that made him feel at ease. Over the next few weeks, their connection grew. Marley didn't push, didn't pry, and allowed Edward to heal at his own pace. For the first time in a long time, he felt a spark of hope for the future. As Edward walked hand in hand with Marley through the city park one evening, Nora and Jack running ahead of them, he realized that life had a way of rebuilding itself. What had been shattered could be mended, not in the same way, but in a way that was still beautiful. Jessica and Derek, however, continued to spiral, trapped in the mess they had created. While Edward's life flourished, theirs became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the cost of betrayal. The morning sunlight poured through the windows of Edward's new home, bathing the room in warmth. It had been years since the chaos that shattered his family, and life had taken on a rhythm that felt peaceful, even joyful. Edward was in the kitchen, flipping pancakes as Nora and Jack sat at the breakfast table, giggling over something on Jack's tablet. Extra syrup today? Edward asked, holding up the bottle with a grin. Yes, please. Nora chirped, her eyes lighting up. Jack leaned over, smirking. Don't forget the whipped cream. It's Sunday, Dad. We need whipped cream. Edward laughed. You two are spoiled. You know that? Just well-loved. Nora shot back, sticking out her tongue playfully. This was their new normal, one filled with laughter, small rituals, and a sense of stability that had been missing for too long. Edward first met Marley at a community fundraiser he had reluctantly attended, coaxed by a business associate who insisted he needed to get out more. The event was bustling with activity, but Edward had kept to the edges, unsure of his place in the lively crowd. He had been pouring himself a drink at the refreshment table when Marley appeared beside him. Trying to decide between lemonade and iced tea, she teased, her voice carrying a light, friendly tone. Edward turned to her, startled at first, then chuckling. Caught me. What would you recommend? Lemonade, she said confidently. It's tangy and sweet, a good balance, just like life should be. Her easy smile and warm presence immediately put him at ease. They began talking first about the fundraiser, then about life, family, and everything in between. Edward found himself drawn to her honesty and groundedness. She didn't pry, didn't ask for more than he was willing to share, but there was something about her that made him want to open up. Their relationship grew slowly, deliberately. Marley was understanding of Edward's past and patient with the walls he still carried. On their third date, as they walked along the river, Edward finally told her about Jessica. It's not an easy story to tell, Edward admitted, his hands stuffed into his jacket pockets. My ex-wife, she broke my trust in ways I never thought possible. Marley listened intently, her eyes steady on his. That must have been devastating, she said softly. It was, he replied, glancing at the water. For a long time, I thought I'd never recover. But my kids, they were my anchor. They gave me a reason to keep going. Marley reached out, touching his arm gently. You're an incredible father, Edward. It's clear how much you love them. And for what it's worth, I think you've done an amazing job rebuilding your life. Her words struck a chord in him. For the first time, Edward felt a glimmer of hope that he could truly move on, not just survive, but thrive. Months passed, and Marley became a steady presence in their lives. She didn't try to replace Jessica, but instead found her own way to connect with Nora and Jack. One evening, as they all played a board game in the living room, Nora looked up at Edward with a thoughtful expression. Dad, she said, pausing to move her game piece, Marley makes you smile. A lot. I like that. Edward smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. She makes me happy, sweetheart. And I'm glad you and Jack like her. Jack, ever the jokester, chimed in. She's cool, but she's terrible at Monopoly. I've already beaten her twice. Marley laughed, playfully nudging Jack's shoulder. Hey, I'll let you win, buddy. The warmth in the room was palpable, a stark contrast to the tense, broken atmosphere that had once defined their home. One day, while they were out for a family picnic, Marley pulled Edward aside as the kids played frisbee nearby. Edward, she began, her tone serious but gentle, I've been thinking a lot about us. About the future. Edward's heart skipped a beat. What about it? She hesitated, then met his gaze. I love you, Edward. And I love Nora and Jack. I know your past has made you cautious, and I respect that. But I want you to know that I'm here for the long haul. If you'll have me. Edward looked at her, emotions swirling in his chest. For so long, he had been afraid to let someone in, afraid to risk being hurt again. But with Marley, it felt different. Safe. I love you too, he said finally, his voice steady. And I want to build a future with you. For us, and for the kids. The next few months were a whirlwind of planning and blending their lives. Marley moved in, and together they created a home that was filled with love, laughter, and new traditions. Jessica's attempts to contact Edward and the kids grew less frequent and more desperate. Each message was a reminder of the life she had thrown away, a life that was now flourishing without her. One evening, as Edward tucked Nora into bed, she looked up at him with a sleepy smile. Daddy, do you think we'll always be this happy? She asked. Edward kissed her forehead, his heart full. I think we will, pumpkin, because we've learned how to take care of each other. And that's what matters most. As he turned off the light and closed her door, Edward felt a deep sense of peace. The scars of the past hadn't vanished, but they had become part of a story that was still unfolding, a story of resilience, love, and second chances. For the first time in years, Edward truly believed that the best was yet to come. It had been 8 years since Edward's life turned upside down, and time had healed many wounds. The charity gala was bustling with life, an annual event in the city that Edward now called home. As he moved through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, he marveled at how far he had come. Don't forget to grab a seat near the front, Marley teased, brushing a speck of lint off his blazer. You're one of the big donors now. People will expect a speech. Edward chuckled. I'd rather just sit back and enjoy the music. But if they insist, I'll keep it short and sweet. Marley smiled, leaning in to adjust his tie. You'll do great. You always do. He kissed her forehead, grateful once again for her presence in his life. She had been his rock through the rebuilding years, and together, they had created a new chapter filled with love and laughter. The evening was in full swing when Edward spotted her. Jessica. She was standing by the bar, a drink clutched in her hand, her gaze distant. Tom had not been kind to her. The vibrant, confident woman he had once known was now a shadow of herself. Her shoulders slumped, her face etched with lines of stress and regret. Edward hesitated for a moment. Part of him wanted to turn away, to avoid the confrontation entirely. But something compelled him to approach. Jessica, he said, his tone even. Her head snapped up, and her eyes widened as she recognized him. Edward, she whispered, her voice trembling. There was a long pause as they regarded each other, the noise of the gala fading into the background. Jessica blinked rapidly, tears pooling in her eyes. I didn't think I'd ever see you again, she said softly. You look happy. I am, Edward replied simply. Life has been good to me. Jessica's lip quivered, and she set her drink down on the bar. I owe you an apology. For everything. I destroyed us, and I destroyed myself in the process. There's not a day that goes by that I don't regret what I did to you and the kids. Edward studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Jessica, I spent a lot of time angry at you. A lot of time wondering what I did wrong, how I could have fixed things. But eventually, I realized it wasn't about me. It was about your choices. And those choices have consequences. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. I know. I lost everything, my family, my friends, even my sense of who I was. I've tried to rebuild, but it's not the same. Edward's gaze softened slightly, but his resolve remained firm. I hope you found some kind of peace, Jessica. For your sake. Jessica reached out as if to touch his arm, but stopped herself. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but do you think the kids might ever want to see me? They're old enough to make their own decisions now, Edward said. But don't expect it to happen overnight. They've had to heal too, and that took time. Jessica looked down, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I'm so sorry, Edward. I'll carry this regret for the rest of my life. Edward nodded slowly, his voice calm but firm. I hope you've learned from it, Jessica, because I've moved on, and I'm not looking back. As Edward turned to walk away, Marley appeared at his side, her expression curious. Was that her? She asked quietly. Yes, Edward replied. Marley slipped her hand into his, giving it a reassuring squeeze. How do you feel? Relieved, Edward said after a moment. Seeing her reminded me of how far I've come, and how much I have to be grateful for. Marley smiled. I'm proud of you, for handling it with grace. As they walked away, Jessica watched them go, a hollow ache settling in her chest. She had spent years trying to piece together a semblance of a life, but seeing Edward happy, successful, and surrounded by love drove home the depth of what she had lost. She thought about Derek, whose life had unraveled just as spectacularly. He had been fired from his job, divorced, and ostracized by their former social circle. They had tried to stay together in the aftermath of the scandal, but their relationship had been built on lies and betrayal, and it crumbled under the weight of reality. Now, Jessica was alone, working a mundane job and living in a small apartment. She had tried to reach out to Nora and Jack over the years, sending letters and emails, but their responses were polite and distant at best. Later that night, as Edward and Marley drove home, Nora called from college. Hey, Dad, did you survive the gala? She teased. Barely, Edward replied with a laugh. How's school? Busy but good. I can't wait to come home for the holidays. Oh, and tell Marley she's still the reigning champion at Scrabble. My roommates and I tried to beat her score last weekend, and it was impossible. Marley grinned from the passenger seat. Tell her I'm ready for a rematch anytime. As the call ended, Edward felt a deep sense of contentment. His children were thriving, his career was flourishing, and he had a partner who truly understood and supported him. Jessica's face flashed in his mind briefly, but he pushed it aside. Her chapter in his life was over, and the final reckoning was complete. Edward glanced at Marley, who was humming softly to the radio, and squeezed her hand. The future was bright, and for the first time in a long time, he felt truly free.